Hello, everybody. Welcome back from the break. It is a great honor and a great pleasure to have Susan Landau, Professor Susan Landau from Tufts University, as our next keynote speaker. Professor Landau has a long history of fighting for privacy. She was one of the chief participants in the first crypto wars, and she worked very hard I don't know how many of you know the crypto wars. But those of you who don't, I urge you to go to Wikipedia after the talk and check what were the first crypto wars about end-to-end encryption and key escrow and how to fight governments who wanted to hinder the ability to encrypt. She's one of the pioneers in understanding that technology is not separated from society, and this is one of the reasons she was such a leader. She won numerous awards, and I think that just going over all of them would be a bit too long. I really urge you to read Privacy on the Line, a book that she wrote with Whitfield Diffie, Surveillance or Security, and of course, Listening. She is notorious for fighting surveillance technologies. She's been nominated as an ACM Fellow in the past. She won the Guggenheim Fellow. She was also nominated, Guggenheim Fellow. She's in the Cybersecurity Hall of Fame, and it's a really great honor and pleasure to have her joining us today. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? I assume yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay. So I'm not showing up on my screen, but I assume I am showing up on yours. Let me know if not. So I'm going to talk today about an unusual topic. I'm going to talk to you about a technological problem, the question of what the National Security Agency was doing when it was collecting call detail records under the law, the USA Freedom Act. There were numerous problems with this collection, or there appeared to be numerous problems with this collection. But what I'm going to talk about mostly is how a technologist looks at this problem and thinks about what a technologist can contribute to the policy discussion. So the talk, I'm going to share screen now, and I'm going to go back and forth between showing you slides and talking. What I am talking about is privacy technology and call detail records, what a computer scientist can add to policy discussions about communications metadata. And this is partially based on work done with Asif Lubin when he was a postdoc at Tufts. So all of this came about because the NSA was collecting call detail records. What happened, as many of you know, is that Edward Snowden disclosed a number of NSA documents, NSA secret, top secret, and so on documents. The first one that appeared in The Guardian was a court order from the FISA court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, authorizing Verizon to collect call detail records of calls domestically within the United States. I happened to be at the NSA, at the Privacy Legal Scholars Conference, along with many other people. And we found ourselves sitting that first morning, each of us getting calls from the New York Times and the National Public Radio and so on about what was going on. It was a really startling story because what was going on is that the US government was collecting records of Americans without a court order. It was collecting them through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, but there had been no court. There had been no law that said that the US government could do so. So what had happened, as we discovered over time, as more and more documents got disclosed, is that the program had been set up in October 2001, shortly after the the attacks on September 11th. And the collection was of all domestic calls, as well as any calls within 2 hops of a, let me say this again. The collection was of all calls, all domestic calls. And the way the call records were accessed was through, if they were within 2 hops of a call originally from Afghanistan, then from Afghanistan and Iraq, and finally from any caller outside the US that was a member of a known terrorist group. So what the US government was collecting was the call detail records of somebody who had been called by a terrorist group or who was in 2 hops, within 2 hops of a terrorist group. Why was that collection being done? Well, as you probably all know, the terrorist attacks on September 11th were conducted by 4 groups of people within the United States who were very carefully directed by Al-Qaeda from outside the United States. And the concern was whether or not there were other cells set up in the US to do those types of attacks or other types of attacks. So this was going to be the way to nip them in the bud. But there had been no legislation to this effect. And in the US, there needs to be such legislation. Now, I know I'm talking partially to an Israeli audience, and you, of course, have dealt with the issue of the call detail records set up for the terrorist database, now then quickly used to track people infected with COVID. So you know what happens when a law is extended peremptorily. In December 2005, the New York Times broke a story about the US warrantlessly wiretapping calls between the US and terrorist groups. Actually, not just terrorist groups, but calls between the US and outside the US without a warrant. At that point, the telephone companies who had been uncomfortable about providing the US government with the call detail records, by the way, are the records of to, from, when the call is made. The companies that had been providing the US government with the call detail records said, hey, wait a minute. We're willing to hand you these records, but we need to do it under a court order. If it comes out that we've been providing you these records without actually having any order to do so, we're going to suffer a lot in the court of public opinion. Provide us with court orders. So in May 2006, the first court order was issued. And then in June 2013, Snowden made the disclosures. And what happened at that point was President Obama said, hey, this is just metadata. It's not call content. We're not listening to your calls. But somehow the US public caught on. I think some of us helped. But the US public caught on to the idea that call detail record can reveal a lot of information. It can reveal who somebody is by simply looking at 4 points, where they are in the evening, where they are in the morning. 4 records are enough to identify a person 95% of the time. They can identify what somebody does. There's a study done out of Stanford that looked at the call detail records and was able, on the basis of call detail records and other public information, to determine whether somebody was going for an abortion, whether somebody was having heart problems, and so on. Call detail records, like most transactional information, are remarkably revelatory. Snowden disclosed this in 2013. There was a large public uproar. And in June 2015, the USA Freedom Act passed. The USA Freedom Act said, okay, the call detail records can still be collected by the companies, because the companies have been doing that forever. They do it for business purposes. That's not what the law said. The law said collected by the companies. They don't say why. And the US government can have access to it under a court order. But so no longer are the detailed records at the NSA. They're at the companies, and they can be accessed under a court order. I had been working on a National Academy study about this, whether there were technical solutions that could work instead of keeping all the records. Was there a technical way to collect what the US government, to access what the US government needed without the US government having all this? And so after the law passed, a year or two later, I spoke with Rick Leggett. Rick Leggett was deputy director of the NSA. And he said, under the USA Freedom Act, everything is going great. We're getting the records we need, and it's working more efficiently. It's just terrific. So I was very curious about this, and I hired a postdoc for us to figure out why this was so. Now, I should have said much earlier, please feel free to ask questions, and Or and Eli, please feel free to interrupt me at any time. It's very hard for you guys to hear a talk like this on Zoom, and I'm really very happy to take questions. Well, I hired my postdoc. He was all ready to start, and 3 months before he started, the NSA shut the program down. The NSA said, there are technical difficulties. We're getting rid of 3 years of data, and you know what? We're not starting it up anytime. At this point, the civil society groups got very concerned. They got concerned about a number of different things. In 2016 and 2017, there had been 40 court orders. Each of those years had 40 court orders on phone numbers outside the US, where the US government, the NSA, was authorized to collect any number within 2 hops. That is, collect the call detail records of any number within 2 hops. The first year, 2016, 151 million call detail records were collected. From 40 orders to 151 call detail records seemed extraordinary. But what was really extraordinary is the following year, 2017, 534 million call detail records were collected. In 2018, the program was shut down for technical irregularities. Well, in 2018, they put away 3 years worth of collection, and in 2019, they shut down the collection. So that's really quite an extraordinary thing to have happened. Are there any questions on this? So again, start with 40 orders, 151 million records collected in 2016 from that 40 orders. So you go 1 hop, 2 hop, and you get 151 million records. And then in 2017, 534 million records. In 2018, just as I'm about to start looking at this problem, not the reason they shut it down, there are technical irregularities, and they get rid of 3 years worth of records. So that's 3 years worth of records from the start of the program, really quite extraordinary. And then they shut the program down. What happens next is, the question is, was it a legal problem? Was it a legal issue that caused them to shut the program down? And we began looking at legal questions, and we discovered that, sorry, this is not what I wanted to share. Trying to go back and forth between sharing the screen and not doesn't work as well as I'd hoped. It was not a legal problem. It was a technical problem. And we began looking at technical issues. We had 3 questions to ask. Our 3 questions were, why did you start? How could you start from 40 orders and end up with 151 million and 534 million, respectively? Why did that happen? Why did NSA halt the program in 2018? And why is NSA saying it will seek not to renew? It won't want to renew. So I should say that after NSA said it didn't want to renew, President Trump said, yes, they're going to renew. But in fact, the law lapsed and they haven't renewed as a result. So the question is, what's going on? So how the program works. So now I'm going to dive into some of the technical issues. What the NSA hands to the telephone companies is a selector, such as a telephone number or an IMEI, the number of the phone. That is not the phone number, but the device number. It provides reasonable and articulable suspicion that the telephone number, the IMEI, the calling card number, or whatever they're giving to the telephone companies is associated with a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power and is engaged in international terrorism or activities related to terrorism. The government presents this justification to the court, which either approves it or not. Once it approves it, then the process starts. And the process is actually a fairly complicated architecture. This is a picture that the NSA supplies. What happens is the NSA, if you go all the way to the left of the slide, the NSA has reasonable and articulable suspicion that somebody in a terrorist organization is contacting someone located within the United States. The FBI signs the application. It goes to the Foreign Intelligence Court. If the court approves it, the order then comes back to the NSA, and the NSA first does its search within its own database to see whether it has seen any number that has connected to that number in the past. Then it goes and sends queries to the phone companies. It iterates on this because it's allowed to do 2 hops. And then it provides analysis and reporting. Any questions? So our first question was, why 40 orders, but 150 million first and second hop call detail records? If you divide 1 million by 40, you get almost 4 million first and second hop orders per court order, which seems rather extraordinary. And when you look at what the NSA provides as a suggestion of how it works, it says, look, we start with phone A. Phone A maybe makes, terrorist head somewhere overseas. Maybe this guy makes 500 calls to phone B and phone C, both of them in the United States. So sorry, phone A is within the United States. It's the number we're interested in. And phone A, who's heading some sort of group, only calls 2 different people, B and C, and makes 500 calls to each number. B and C make 500 calls each to D, E, F, and G. You look at that, you say, wait a minute, that's 3,000 calls. How do you get 3,000 calls and you multiply 3,000 calls by 40 orders, you don't get 150 million. Something is wrong here. So I'd like to tell you a story that is familiar to many people in Israel and maybe familiar to others of you. Rafik Hariri had been prime minister of Lebanon. He resigned because he found he couldn't accomplish what he wanted to do, but he was planning to run again. He was warned by Syria and Hezbollah not to try to become prime minister again. On the day he was assassinated, he left home for the parliament, and he stopped at the parliament. He was in, of course, a motorcade, a highly protected motorcade. He stopped at parliament. He visited with people there. Then he was about to leave when he ran into a journalist. So he stopped at a cafe nearby, met with the journalist, and then continued on to wherever he was planning to go. Except that he never made it because a truck bomb hit his motorcade and he was killed. And that's what people knew. The question is, what happened? Who was responsible? This was 2005, when how we did investigations was much less sophisticated than now. But one of the investigators in Lebanon started pulling cell phone records. And as he pulled a lot of records, he found some very interesting patterns. He discovered that there were calls, that small subsets of groups that called each other. A red group, a green group, a purple group, a blue group. Each of these groups had only one person that called the green group, the head organization. The green group had but 3 people, a head and 2 working under him. And the 2 working under him would call the heads of the other groups, but the head of the green group would never call the others. The groups called within each other, and one of them would call the heads of the other groups, but that's it. He found that 2 different groups were tracking Harari. One group was running logistics. And from tracking the cell phone records, they were able to actually determine who who was responsible for this. The group had practiced relatively good operational security. Occasionally, one of them would screw up. One of them would make a personal call off of one of their green, blue, purple, red phones, and that enabled better identification of them. But of course, where the phones went enabled identification. And if they were carrying 2 phones in their pocket, the other phone being their personal phone, then of course, where their personal phone slept at night and got up in the morning and so on, gave away a lot of information. From all of this, that led to the court case that happened in The Hague recently, in which there were fewer convictions than one would expect. But it provided an insight, a public version of the insight, into how the phones were actually used. So we go back to that picture of 500 calls each to B and C, 500 calls to D, E, F, and G, and realize that the numbers are a lot more complex than the diagram would indicate. How complex are they? Well, let me show you some things. First of all, each phone has alternate identifiers. It has the IMEI, which numbers the phone, which is the phone name, that is the number of the individual phone. That number was created 20 years ago to prevent phone fraud. There's the IMSI, the phone number, the subscriber name, calling card number. That adds a factor of 4. But when it adds a factor of 4 actually 2 different times. That is, when you get the selector, you can multiply it by 4 because you have 4 different times that you can use it. But then each time you do the hops, you can add a factor of 4 again. The law doesn't say anything about going backwards in time. We tend to think of going forwards in time, but you can go both backwards in time and forwards in time. That adds a factor of 2. You get another factor of 2 by the fact that every call detail record comes from 2 providers. The person being called gets a call detailed record, and the person calling has a call detail record. And then, although the law doesn't say anything about SMS, and the slides that the NSA provides to the public doesn't say anything about SMS, in fact, the NSA was collecting on texts as well as on calls. And that adds a factor of at least 2, probably more than 2, because in fact, who are terrorists? It's not old people like me, it's young people. And young people text a lot more than old people. So the first hop has 4 selectors times 80 daily communications times 180 days. How did we get 80 daily communications? We started looking at how much people use phones, how much young people use phones. And 180 days is how long the court order can go for. That gets you to 58,000 call detail records for A, B, and C. But then we actually had another question, which is, how many distinct contacts do people have? It turns out that data is hard to get. There's a study in China that looks at how many distinct contacts people have within a month. That one came in at 500. We divided by 2. That seemed a rather extreme number. Maybe 245 is high. But once you factor that in, you get 6 million call detail records on the second hop. So all of a sudden, you're getting numbers that are a lot closer to what the NSA had than the picture that the NSA presented. and it comes from that 50 contacts. So the NSA gave an instructive picture, but it was not exactly the picture that, that seems to provide the numbers. And only by looking at how phones are used can you get these numbers. Now, is that a question that a policy person could ask? Of course. Is it a question that a technologist is more likely to ask? Absolutely. Because we're going to say, well, wait a minute, are those numbers right? How do phones really work? And so that's what a technologist asks and adds to this particular issue. But there was more. There was one more thing, which is that there are marketing calls. All of you get marketing calls on your cells. You try to delete them, you try to ignore them. But those marketing calls add substantially to the numbers. And what's more, if you're the NSA, you can't shut down the marketing number. That is, when you're collecting at the hops, you have to actually look at the marketing numbers. And the reason for that, oops, why is this over there? Let me go back. Why are we looking at the marketing numbers? Because the marketing numbers are not apparent as marketing numbers when they call phone B. That is, there's an incoming call to phone B, and the NSA picks that up. But the NSA doesn't realize it's a marketing number until it goes to phone D, and then it realizes where that number is. So I want to stop sharing screen. I have. Okay. So that gets us to 6 million. But then why did the NSA halt the program? So the first guess by all the civil liberties groups was that the NSA was collecting location, which it wasn't allowed to do. The law was very clear that it was not allowed to collect location. If you're a technologist, you say, is it going to collect location? And the answer is, of course not. Because when location comes in on a call detail record, if you're the NSA and you get location, you say, this doesn't fit the format, we're not allowed to collect. It doesn't make any sense. So if you're a technologist, you say, that's the wrong answer. So what is the right answer? And the right answer turns out to be rather complicated. The right answer turns out to involve the way that calls work when you're making cell calls. And now I will give you the most complicated, so when we talked to the NSA said to us, the record on its face didn't look like it had a problem, but a comparison with other records showed it had a problem. But that only happened rarely. So we now had a mystery. What happens that sometimes produces incorrect records, but does it only occasionally? And that was the problem we had to solve. And I am going to show you that problem. So what we have here is how a cell phone works. On the right, you have Alice. On the left, you have Bob. Alice is calling, they're calling from cell phones between two countries. Bob's call gets picked up by the local cell tower. It goes through the base station, goes through wire to the base station, to the mobile switching station. The base station is right here, the blue oval. It goes to the mobile switching station, the international gateway. It goes through signaling. Yes.
Sorry, currently you're not sharing with us, and while we're at it.
Okay.
Earlier,
I don't know. Thank you for telling me.
How long is asking the process from the point of time you're requesting the information until the information arrived to the NSA?
Okay, so I see. I didn't. Okay. Now do you have it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Good. Sorry. Thank you. I see what I did wrong. I apologize. So let me start that again. Bob is making a call to Alice. It goes through his cell phone from the cell tower to the base station so BCS to the mobile switching station to the international gateway through signaling system 7 to the international gateway in France to the mobile switching station to the base station to Alice. Fairly complicated procedure. Things you need to know. So Bob is on a wire line. Alice is on a cell phone. When Alice is on a cell phone, she gets a temporary number while she's on the cell phone. And the reason for the temporary number is so that nobody should be able to track her as she moves around mobily, form of protection. Okay? As the call is connected, so Bob calls Alice, and he calls her IMSI, that is her IMSI number, the International Mobile Subscribers Identity. That number is used only on the home network. That Alice is traveling from the United States. So IMSI is only used on the home network. What she gets when she's traveling anywhere is TIMSI, a temporary mobile subscriber identity. So when she's traveling in France, when she's traveling in the United States, wherever she is, she gets a temporary mobile subscriber identity. And that changes sometimes between calls, sometimes every half hour, sometimes more occasionally. That's one number she has. But she also has an external identifier, MSISDN. That's the identifier that says which network she's on. So she has 3 different identifiers. When Bob calls Alice, and this is the complicated part, when Bob calls Alice, he's using her identifier that says which network she's on. Alice's home location register transforms that to the international one and then converts it to a mobile station roaming number. That mobile station roaming number has to be used within 10 minutes or the number goes away. I wrote 10 minutes. I think it's actually 10 seconds. I apologize. I believe that's 10 seconds. That phone number, that call gets set up with Bob's mobile switching station and Alice's MSRN. Fairly complicated to tell you everything I've just said. So let me put it to you a different way. What Bob's, and in order for you to fully understand it, you actually have to read our paper. I apologize. What I'm trying to convey across here is that there are multiple different phone numbers between the different switching stations. And the different switching stations have recordings of different numbers. So Bob's switching station has a record of the phone number as Bob's MSISDN and Alice's IMSI. Alice's switching station uses the temporary number assigned to her for the purpose of this call. When the record happens, now this is a record in France, but if the record were to happen the other way, that MSRN is a temporary number. That temporary number, if it shows up in the NSA collection, will not, I want to go back to not sharing screen, but I don't see how to do that. I've lost you guys. Stop share. Sorry. That temporary number will only be available briefly, and then it will be assigned within a few days or a few weeks to somebody else. But if the record the NSA received included that temporary number, it would start collecting against that temporary number. Only much later did it realize it was making a mistake. Are you guys with me in what I'm saying? I don't expect you to follow all the different pieces, but I'm asking if the general picture makes sense. Are there any questions on it?
So there was one question earlier. About the length of the process from beginning to end with respect to how much time it takes for a CDR request to be processed. But
I'm not sure of the answer. I think it's actually relatively quick. I think it's a matter of hours or day, not more. It's an automated process, and I think it goes quite quickly.
From my perspective, the description.
I'm sorry?
From my side, the description you gave was very, I don't want to say concise, but very accurate and clear, but we're waiting to see if somebody else.
Okay, good, thank you. So all of a sudden, now what we have is a technologist saying, hey, they threw out the records because there was a technical problem that nobody thought about. And it's a technical problem that fits their answer. The records looked like they were correct, and it was only in retrospect that they weren't. It happened in a small set of cases. It was impossible to tell ahead of time. Now that they know the problem, however, it's easy to architect against it, because you just architect against taking the records that have that temporary number. So why didn't they continue the program? Why is NSA saying it won't seek to renew? And that required thinking a little bit more about phones and terrorism. So in 2001, Osama bin Laden, sitting in a cave in Afghanistan, he wasn't actually in a cave at the time, he went to a cave later, but Osama bin Laden, sitting in Afghanistan, was able to direct plots in great detail that were happening abroad. He did it in Kenya, he did it in the United States, he did it in numerous places. But if you look in 2020 or in 2018, when when the NSA stopped collecting, that wasn't how terrorism was happening in the United States. Terrorism in the United States was happening through ISIS. It was homegrown violent extremists, and they weren't getting phone calls or emails specifically directing them to go against the Brooklyn Bridge or the stock market or the White House. They were just being told, get a truck and drive it through a crowded group of people. Get a knife and stab people on the subway, and so on. And that's what they were being told. But they were being told it in very different ways. And one of the things that happened is you didn't really need the collection of call detail records. They weren't using phones. The terrorists weren't being directed. There weren't specific plots. And furthermore, the way you could track them was completely different. The way you could track them was through the internet. That is, they would start by communicating, listening to extremists on videotapes and so on. They might, on YouTube, they might try to connect. Then they would move to an encrypted communication. But in the process of doing so, they were using the internet to communicate. And the NSA had another tool in its pocket. And this was something called Section 702. Section 702 allows the US to collect against internet providers in bulk, not in bulk, in certain cases. And what you found in 2016, in 2017, is members of the intelligence community saying, Section 702 now provides, quote, critical foreign intelligence that cannot practically be obtained through other methods. It's a statement from Robert Litt, who was the counsel for the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Or Matt Olson, who headed the National Counterterrorism Center, said, against the backdrop of a dynamic and lethal terrorism threat posed by ISIS, the ability of the United States to conduct surveillance under Section 702 is vital to our security. What they would say about the ability to get the call detail records, they would say, well, in conjunction with other programs, it's really quite useful. But they wouldn't say that it was critical. So was this obvious in 2015? Was it obvious that the terrorism threat had changed between 2001 and 2015? Yes, it was changing beginning in around 2006 and certainly changed by the early 2010s. Why was this? The US and its allies had largely decimated the leadership of Al-Qaeda, partially through assassinations and arrests, and partially through going after finances. If these guys didn't have money, they couldn't operate in the same way. The second thing was that communications had changed. If you look at the use of phones and mobile communications, whether you're looking in Yemen or Afghanistan or anywhere across the globe, usage was, not Europe, usage was small in 2000. In Europe, it was already beginning. It was not tiny in 2000. Usage was small in 2000. By 2010, it was very large. And that meant that the communication modality switched. First of all, people went to call to mobile phones, but then they also went to internet over the phone, and they went to internet communications. So the question is, why did Congress fail to see this? And the answers are threefold. One is, in 2013, there were the Snowden disclosures. And like anybody else, Congress has its pride. And the government has its pride. Snowden disclosed all this information. Was the US government going to give up its tool that Snowden had disclosed? Was it going to give away a tool that Snowden had disclosed? Or was it going to try to make it legal to use the tool? So there was a certain amount of that. There was a certain amount of simply not understanding the technology. And they didn't ask the right questions. They were so focused on privacy and civil liberties, hot button issues, that they didn't focus on efficacy. Is this the best tool for the project? Is this the best tool for what we need? So there was a certain amount of pride, and there was a certain amount of failure to understand technology. So what's the long-term message? The long-term message is a counterterrorism rule that plays a critical role today may not be useful tomorrow. But oversight bodies must systematically review the efficacy of each program under their supervision. Otherwise, we allow authorities that are neither necessary nor wise, and in so doing, protect neither our security nor our liberty. But there's another piece to that. And the other piece to that is the role that scientists and engineers play in policy discussions. To ask this question, you want to ask a question as a technologist. So are all these issues that I've described to you, the fact that the tool was that people no longer communicated over phone, they communicated over internet, that they were not directing closely, but directing from afar, was all of that obvious? Yes, it was. But a technologist is much more likely to ask that sort of question because they ask how the tools are being used. And so I want to end with a story. And the story is about the person who inspired me to think these ways. His name is Joe Rotblat. He won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1995. He was a physicist in Poland, but in 1938, he received a fellowship to work with Chadwick in England, and he went to England in 1938. In 1939, he got additional funding, so he went home to Poland to bring his wife with him, to come back with him for the year to England. She had an attack of appendicitis. He made it back to, and he needed to get back to England. He made it back. She never did. He was in England during the war. He was thinking about nuclear fission. And in fact, when he went back in the summer of '39, he talked to his advisor. Like many physicists at that time, he thought about the possibility of a bomb. And his advisor couldn't advise him on whether or not that was something reasonable to work on. The American project on the bomb and the British project on the bomb were pursuing simultaneous tracks. And Churchill and Roosevelt decided to bring the two projects together. It made much more sense to bring the projects together in the United States, which was not suffering bombing from the Germans. And so the British project went over to join in Los Alamos. Originally, Rotblat did not. Rotblat intended to return to Poland after the war, and so he still had his Polish citizenship, and the US was not willing to bring along a Polish citizen. Only Brits were allowed. But Chadwick spoke with General Groves, who was heading the Los Alamos project, and an exception was made for Rotblat. Now, when Rotblat decided to work on the bomb, he decided to work on the bomb only because it was important that the Allies develop a bomb before the Nazis do so. Rotblat, as you might guess, was very close with Chadwick. So when he arrived in Los Alamos, he spent a lot of time with Chadwick. On D-Day, or shortly after D-Day, the Americans sent in a team of physicists to see where the Germans were on the bomb. They wanted to check what Werner Heisenberg had accomplished. Because if Werner Heisenberg had made progress, then the Nazis, if it all depended on Heisenberg, essentially. If Heisenberg had not figured out how to build a bomb, then the Nazi project and the bomb had not succeeded. And so this team of physicists followed the army in shortly after D-Day. Sometimes they were ahead of the tanks, sometimes they were behind the tanks. They found Heisenberg. Heisenberg, as we all know, had not succeeded in building a bomb. The Nazis did not have the bomb. That news came back to Los Alamos, and Chadwick and Rotblat learned about it in late 1944. Rotblat left the project at that point. He came back across to the United States and back to England. The Groves and many others were quite angry with him. He was not allowed to speak about the bomb, of course, until after 45, after the bomb dropped. But he was the one significant thing is he was the only one to leave the project after it was discovered that the Germans hadn't built a bomb. All the other physicists, just like technologists, scientists, engineers, it happens to us all the time. We get so caught up in the science, so caught up in the engineering, that we can't help but follow it through. It was only after the test in the sands of New Mexico that the physicists tried going to Washington to say, we have this bomb, let's not use it. But the control was no longer in their hands. And as we all know, the bombs dropped. After the war, when the war ended, Rotblat left nuclear physics and began working on nuclear medicine. But in the mid-1950s, he approached Bertrand Russell with the idea of a manifesto that said that scientists should take social responsibility for their actions. 11 or 13 people signed this manifesto, including Einstein. Rotblat was the only non-Nobel laureate on the manifesto. Started a movement. Scientists around the globe said, let's meet as scientists and try to work as scientists on nuclear nonproliferation, ending the bomb. And they got an offer from from a Canadian industrialist, Cyrus Eaton, who offered them funding if they would meet in the city of Pugwash, or town of Pugwash in Nova Scotia. These became known as the Pugwash conferences. This is a picture of the first Pugwash conference. Rotblat is the man in the white shirt in the back row, no tie. They met in Pugwash and other places around the globe ever since. They're the ones behind the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. They're the ones behind many of the treaties we have, the Treaty on Chemical Weapons, treaties on biology weapons. They meet as scientists, talk as scientists, work as scientists. No journalists are allowed. Then they go back and meet with their respective governments. I found what he had done and the importance of thinking of the social impact of our science a guiding light in my career. And I wanted to share that with you. I'm not expecting everybody to become a Rotblat, but I am saying we can offer more than just our science, and thinking about the social implications is really important. And often we have things we can add purely as scientists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for a wonderful talk. Very eye-opening talk. I will start with the questions while they pour in through the Q&A and the chat, asking, it seems like you're calling from, as a scientist, that more scientists could go into the public, God forbids, and in speaking with politicians, even worse, and sort of like, it is time for us to leave the ivory tower, and I find this a bit disturbing.
So I have to say, so I'm married to a complexity theorist, and one day he came home. So, you know, what does he do? He proves theorems for a living, right? And so one day he came home and I said, I figured out Washington. And he said, yes. And I said, facts are 10% of the equation. And he looks at me like I'm completely lost it. And I say it again. And you know, I realize this conversation is going nowhere. But when I talk to policy people in Washington, they say, right. So the answer is no, I'm not expecting all of us, or even most of us, or even a significant percentage of us to go to Washington or Jerusalem or London or Brussels. I really appreciate those of us, including Ross, including Vanessa, who do that, and I think it's tremendously useful. What I am saying is the other part of what Rutbot did, which is he thought about why he was doing the science, what the reason behind the science was. He was the only one who left the bomb project, and the only one who raised misgivings before the bomb was ready to go. And thinking about why what you do, why you're doing what you're doing, what the social implications of the technology is critically important. So I've spent the summer writing a book on contact tracing apps. And if I look at cryptographers in Europe, in the United States, a lot of them have been involved in the exposure notification apps. That's exactly a case where they're thinking about the contact tracing apps, some things like Trace Together or Arogya Setu in Singapore and in India, respectively, and saying, no, we want a more privacy protective scheme. What are the social implications of something that does proximity checking? Some of us think about that all the time. I would like to see more of us think about it all the time as we work our technology. I don't want to see all of us trading our T-shirts in for a suit jacket and going down to, as I said, Jerusalem, London, Brussels, Delhi, and so on.
Well, it seems like Professor Smith and Mr. Smith, but Professor Landau and Professor Anderson had to go to Washington and London, respectively. There is a question from the audience. Professor Landau mentions about a specific publication of hers to read to know more about this topic. Which publication is that?
So this particular paper is called Explaining the Anomalies, blah, blah, blah. I can't remember the whole title. Explaining the Anomalies. I have it up on my webpage. I have all my things up on my webpage. It's my webpage is Privacy Inc., PRIVACYINK.org. If you Google me, you'll find it very quickly. If you want to learn about the crypto wars, there are several different versions of the crypto wars. The classic book is the one I did with Witt, Privacy on the Line. I testified in Congress in 2016 on the Apple FBI case. And out of that, I wrote a book on locking phones, and that's called Listening In. And both of those are on my webpage, as well as a book about wiretap policy.
So again, while we are waiting for more questions, I see there's a lot of interaction with the parliament, the government, the senators, and you mentioned that they care about 10% at most about facts, and I think that in Israel we had several examples of that, discussions around the contact tracing, the biometric database, and the powers that run behind the scenes. On the other side, seems to be very strong, and I'm going to say a bit crudely anti-sciencey, meaning trying to not listen to scientists. Do you have any formula how to, I understand that, example, in the US you have Ron Whedon, who seems to be like a decent guy, at least listening to technologists. How do you deal with cases where nobody listens?
So you're asking two different questions, actually, at least. And the first question, which is, how do you deal with an administration who says no masks, use unproved, drink bleach. Drink bleach. I mean, that's that's a social scientist question, and it's a crazy-making question. I mean, from having spent some time thinking about the Second World War and how could people listen to such crazy things, one knows that sometimes it just takes time, as well as other things, for truth to surface. So that part of things is a question well beyond my ken. The part of your question about how do you influence Washington. So there are multiple different ways. I've just started, I'm directing a program at Tufts. My position is joint between the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the Department of Computer Science. And tomorrow we start our master's degree in cybersecurity and public policy. The idea of this degree is to take in students in both policy and international relations and political science and students in computer science. Both of them get exposed to things like privacy in the digital age, international cyber conflict, cyber law, and so on. The non-technical students learn a certain amount of technical material. The technical students, if they want to explore further and learn more advanced technical material, more power to them. But the point of this degree is to train translators, whether they sit in a CEO's office, or they sit in a senator's office, or they sit in a civil society organization. I don't expect them to be the expert who writes the paper that we did about how the phone calls, how the records got messed up, or where the numbers come from. But I expect them to be able to read that and be able to say, yes, that makes sense, and then go to the policy person in Washington and say, no, we can't write they were collecting location, because in fact, that's unlikely. So one thing is to train people that way. The other thing is the US now has funding through the Hewlett Foundation to send people to work in Congress for a year. Through something called Tech Congress. I believe that's funded by Hewlett, but I'm not sure. But we have something called Tech Congress. AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, does the same thing. Bringing scientists into the discussion, if we supply them. So Ron Wyden, for example, has a scientist on his staff, somebody with a PhD in computer science or information science. How did that person come? He originally got a fellowship to work in Congress. Congress found him useful. Somebody in Congress found him useful, and there he is permanently. So those sorts of things, which the American Association for the Advancement of Science has been doing for a long time, but now the tech community is more interested too. I think they're critical.
Sorry, you referred to wearing masks. So I had to.
Yes, I got it.
So I would like to thank you very much once again. It was a wonderful experience. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.